Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. We start again with the Canada story. Justin Trudeau has spoken again. He says he will not provide proof, but he wants India to cooperate in the investigation. Meanwhile, his team is planting stories in the media. It's now a game of selective leaks. One report says Indian diplomats in Canada were spied upon and their exchanges are a giveaway. Meanwhile, Trudeau's ratings are falling. A new poll is out. It says if Canada were to hold an election today, Trudeau would lose. We'll bring you the details, the analysis and the impact it is having on people. In other news, China is back to its old tricks. It is targeting Indian athletes from Arunachal Pradesh. We'll tell you how India has responded. Nepal's Prime Minister is heading to China and that too for 8 days. Why Zelensky is losing allies as the war in Ukraine drags on. How it was Sudan versus Sudan at the United Nations General Assembly. Why Europe is targeting Russian diamonds and how it may hurt India. And South Korea's new law to protect teachers. All this and more coming up. The headlines first. Ukraine attacks Russia's Black Sea fleet in Crimea. A Ukrainian missile struck Moscow's naval headquarters in Sevastopol. This is the latest assault by Kiev on the peninsula. Ukraine has vowed to recapture Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. Iran and Djibouti restore ties after 7 years. The decision comes after Iran and Saudi Arabia resumed diplomatic relations. In 2016, the African nation had severed ties with Tehran in support of Riyadh. Djibouti sits on one of the world's busiest shipping routes. Thaksin Shinawatra could act as an advisor to the new government of Thailand. His party leads the ruling coalition in the country. Thaksin is currently serving a jail term after returning to Thailand last month. The 74-year-old was ousted in a military coup in 2006. A blockbuster movie is scaring Chinese tourists away from Thailand. The Chinese movie No More Bets talks about cybercrime in Southeast Asia. It shows an unnamed country very similar to Thailand. The Thai economy depends heavily on tourism, particularly from China. MotoGP says sorry to Indian fans after displaying a map of the country without Kashmir. Angry fans took to social media to protest, prompting the apology. The premier global motorbike competition is holding its first ever race in India. And this is a conference you won't be able to shake it off. Australia will host an academic convention on Taylor Swift. Firstpost, as they call it, will be held at the Melbourne University next year. It will focus on Taylor Swift's impact on gender, literature and the economy. Canada's spat with India is entering a new phase. Ottawa is changing its approach. They're trying to reclaim the narrative from verbal volleys. Canada is shifting to selective leaks. Some stories have come out today, all with source-based information. They're attributed to the government of Canada. None of these officials is speaking on record. Different Western media outlets have published these stories, all with similar conclusions. Broadly, there are 3 takeaways. 1, Canada is apparently sitting on clinching evidence. There is some secret intelligence, and it's been gathered through questionable means. 2, their Western allies are helping them. They're feeding more intelligence to Ottawa. And 3, they're making demands from India, not just Trudeau. Apparently, Joe Biden too raised this with Prime Minister Modi. And what was India's response? We'll discuss that. Let's start with the leaks. The first one came from Canada itself. Their public broadcaster published this. It basically says Canada is not lying. It does have intelligence. But what kind of intelligence? Both human and signals intelligence. Apparently enough to establish a link between India and the death of Nijjar. Now, a quick recap here. Canada is investigating the death of this man, Hardeep Singh Nijjar. He died in a shooting incident in the month of June this year. He is a Khalistani, a sanctioned terrorist. He ran a banned terrorist outfit out of Canada. Nijjar was also involved in the Khalistan referendum. He was whipping up support for the breakup of India and for a separate Khalistani state for Sikhs. Now, this is a separatist terrorist campaign. Canada is giving such groups a safe haven. And now it says it has credible intelligence linking India to Nijjar's death. This report was published today. It talks about the intelligence gathered so far. And what kind of proof does Canada have? We do not know that. Not yet. The report does not give details. All it says is Ottawa has proof against Indian diplomats. It has communications which could be relevant to this case. That's all. Now, two problems with the so-called proof. One, the world still doesn't know what it is. And if and when it does come out, it will have to be scrutinized. Problem number two, were Indian diplomats snooped upon? It seems that they were. Indian diplomats were being watched in Canada, not just by Canadian sleuths, but also by Canada's allies. We are talking about the Five Eyes, the intelligence sharing alliance, Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. These are the Five Eyes members. Reports say one of these Five Eyes members had intel about Indian diplomats and they passed it on to Canada. Is that legal? Can diplomats be spied upon? Do they not enjoy certain protections? Well, they do. Diplomats have special rights. Their rights are spelled out in the Vienna Convention. It doesn't say very much about spying in particular, but it does talk about the protection and privacy of diplomatic missions, diplomatic bags, and diplomats themselves from any persecution and prosecution, rather. Did Canada or its allies violate any of these rules? It's hard to say because we don't really know how they gathered the evidence they claim to have. Yesterday, Justin Trudeau spoke again. He refused to release the evidence, but he called on India to join the investigation.
There is no question that India is a country of growing importance and a country that we need to continue to work with, not just in the region, but around the world. And we're not looking to provoke or cause problems. That's why we call upon the government of India to work with us.
Trudeau is just repeating himself here, while his officials are going around planting stories. Let me show you another one. This is about Canada's claims again. It says Biden discussed the case with Prime Minister Modi and it happened during the G20 summit. So what did Prime Minister Modi tell Joe Biden? That they don't know or they haven't written about. But when the Indian Prime Minister spoke to Justin Trudeau during the very same summit, he rejected his claims. And India has been firm in its rejection. It's unlikely to change. What is America's position? Here's what the White House said.
There's not some special exemption you get for actions like this, regardless of the country. We will stand up and defend our basic principles, and we will also consult closely with allies like Canada as they pursue their law enforcement and diplomatic process.
It's a bit rich coming from the US. What basic principles will they defend? They invaded Iraq, they invaded Afghanistan, they routinely launch drone strikes, they engineer regime changes. Ask Imran Khan. America has mastered the craft of foreign interference. So I'm not sure they are in a position to give special exemptions. But that's another story. We'll save it for another day. For now, we focus on Justin Trudeau. He wants condemnation from the West and cooperation from India for some credible proof he claims to have, but he won't share. Justin Trudeau made his allegation on Monday. Since then, everyone is asking the same question. Why? Why make such a public spectacle? Why not handle the issue diplomatically? A recent opinion poll could have the answer. Canadians were asked to choose their next Prime Minister. Look at their response. 40% respondents picked Pierre Poilievre. 40%. He leads the Conservative Party. That's the main opposition in Canada. And how much did Trudeau get? 31%. Only 3 out of 10 Canadians want Justin Trudeau to stick around. Number 3 is also a familiar face, Jagmeet Singh. He's a Khalistani. He received 22% of the vote. So the big takeaway is this. If elections were to be held today, Justin Trudeau would lose. The Conservative Party will form the government in Canada. And there's a message for Jagmeet Singh too. His support has slipped 4 points since September last year. So Trudeau is on shaky ground. His own popularity is plunging, and so is that of his Khalistani buddy. And this relationship is crucial to the story. You see, Trudeau leads a minority government. His party, the Liberals, do not have a majority in Parliament. So how are they in power? Thanks to Jagmeet Singh. His party offers outside support to Trudeau, sort of like a kingmaker. And what does this kingmaker think of the allegations? The allegations against India. Listen to his statement. To all Canadians, this is my vow. I will leave no stone unturned in the pursuit of justice, including holding Narendra Modi accountable. That's what Jagmeet Singh has said. How about that? Zero proof, zero credible information. And who does Jagmeet Singh blame? The Prime Minister of India. Not even diplomats or embassy staff, straight to the Prime Minister. And this attitude betrays the intentions of Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh. They're playing to the gallery. Sikhs make up 2.1% of Canada's population. I know it does not sound like very much, but their political clout is much more. And the reason for that is Canada's election system. Let me explain and listen to this carefully. Here in India, political parties pick candidates. They have high commands or election executives. They give the tickets. These bodies select the candidates who will contest an election. Canada has a different system. Many commentators call it pay to play. The Canadian system, pay to play. Let's assume you want to contest, you want to run in an election. Then you must mobilize voters from your party. They have to gather, submit a form, and pay a fee. Only then will you be nominated. Who would you call for something like this? Maybe family, or friends, or colleagues. But what if you had an organized religious congregation, one where every family knows the other? One where every family is relatively well off? That's the Sikh community in Canada. And within that community, Khalistanis have an upper hand. We've seen their rallies and referendums. Clearly, mobilization is not a problem for them. And this faulty system has poisoned Canadian politics. A minority within a minority has hijacked the narrative in Canada. And leaders like Justin Trudeau are playing along. Same within his own party. Some within, rather, his own party are calling him out. Like Chandra Arya. He's a Liberal Party lawmaker. He says terrorism cannot be glorified as free speech. Listen to what he said.
I can't understand how glorification of terrorism or a hate crime targeting a religious group is allowed in the name of freedom of speech and expression.
You heard him. That was Trudeau's own MP, and he's right. Most Canadian Sikhs do not support Khalistan. Only a tiny minority do. And Trudeau's support has emboldened this tiny minority. India gave him every opportunity to correct this mistake. Sources tell us that New Delhi submitted 26 extradition requests to Canada. 26 requests. How many did Canada approve? 0. These are bona fide separatists and terrorists. There is evidence against them. It was presented to Canada, yet Canada shielded them. Maybe even weaponized them. We have learned from our sources that Hardeep Singh Nijjar was working for the Canadian intelligence. This is what Indian sources are telling us, that Nijjar could have been working for Canada. If true, this is massive. Hardeep Nijjar was a designated terrorist. He was an enemy of India. Instead of cracking down on him, Canada may have weaponized him. Yet Trudeau blames India. He keeps talking about not provoking, but his actions suggest otherwise. On Monday, Canada expelled an Indian diplomat from their country. They revealed his name. They also revealed that he was a RAW agent. RAW is the Research and Analysis Wing. It is India's foreign intelligence agency. And this is a major escalation. Our sources say India trusted Canada with this information. We do that with friendly countries. We tell them who the intelligence officer is. This is supposed to be confidential information. But Canada went public with it. They blew the officer's cover. Again, why so much drama? This is a question for Justin Trudeau to answer. His actions make one thing clear, though. He's willing to stake everything on this fight. Because this is not about Canada or its people. This is about Trudeau's political future. This is like a boxing match now. Both sides are trading blows. But what about the people caught in between? Real lives are being affected, first by Canada's appeasement of Khalistanis and now by Justin Trudeau's dramatic actions in support of a sanctioned terrorist. Yesterday, India closed visa services to Canadians. The move led to panic. Canadian visitors, travelers, and even Indians rushed to airports. They changed their travel plans. They decided to leave before the row escalated further. And the result was this. Airfares have shot up dramatically by as much as 25%. So what do the prices look like? $1,000 for a round trip, economy class from New Delhi to Toronto or Vancouver, $1,000. This was the usual rate. And what are the prices like now? $1,300, in some cases more than $2,000. It's a serious spike. And it's because of the surge in demand. But why are people in a hurry to leave? Different people have different concerns and different reasons. The tourists are afraid of border restrictions that may come into force. As of now, there is no indication that this will happen. Neither side has made any move to impose such border restrictions. But given the present climate, no one wants to take a chance. The community that's most worried is the students. They are in a fix. And they all have one question: should they still make plans to study in Canada? Unfortunately, no one has the answer. Even Canadian universities are not sure. Some of them spoke to prospective students this week and they told them, don't pack your bags just yet. Canadian universities have 2 academic sessions. The spring session starts in January. The fall session begins in August. So university officials are advising students and they're telling them, delay your enrollment. Instead of January, come to Canada in the month of August. Start your classes in the fall session. Now, for the record, Canada has not stopped issuing student visas. Then why are these universities worried? Well, they feel the diplomatic turmoil could lead to visa delays. Students might find it hard to get a visa, so it's better to wait it out. And remember, Canadian universities want Indian students. They account for a large chunk of their revenue. Last year, more than 200,000, more than 2 lakh Indian students enrolled in Canada. These students gave Canada's GDP a bump. In 2021, Indian students boosted Canada's GDP by almost $5 billion. So a complete halt will hurt Canada economically. Not to mention, leave these students in the lurch. Now, what about the students who are already there? They're a worried lot. And the uncertainty is not helping them. There are many stories in the Canadian press. These students have wide-ranging concerns. Some of them wanted to bring their families to Canada. They're not so sure anymore. They're also worried about a possible retaliation from Ottawa. Plus, the security assessment is concerning. New Delhi, as we told you earlier, has issued an advisory. Indian citizens have been asked to exercise extreme caution, to remain vigilant. Students have been asked to share their contact. The Indian mission in Canada is creating a database. And this situation is deeply unsettling, not just for these students and their families, but also for the business community. Before the crisis blew up, business ties were growing. In 2022, Canada sold fossil fuels worth nearly $1 billion to India, fertilizers worth more than $700 million, and plant fibers worth almost $400 million to India. Now, some of you may not know this, but India depends on Canada for key commodity supplies like pulses, and one of them is masoor dal, or the red lentil. Canada is India's largest supplier of red lentil. And how much did India buy last year? More than 5 lakh tons. This was worth over $400 million. India, too, was doing good business with Canada. India's major exports include pharmaceutical products, iron and steel, and nuclear reactors and boilers. Last year, the value of this trade was worth almost $300 million. Canada invests in the Indian markets as well. It is India's 17th largest foreign investor. Since the year 2000, Canada has poured in more than $3 billion into the Indian markets. Now that their Prime Minister has picked a fight with India, what is the outlook for these investments? What happens to the traders? Will they have to look for new customers? And what happens to the Indian students? Their fate hangs in the balance. The Asian Games are set to begin tomorrow. China is hosting them, so expect 2 things: some good sporting action and some not so good political opportunism. We've already seen incident number 1. On Thursday, India's wushu team landed in China. Wushu is a martial art. It is said to have originated in China. Now, India's wushu team had 11 members, but 3 of them never made it to China. Why is that? India says because Beijing denied them entry. All 3 athletes are from Arunachal Pradesh. China claims this region as part of South Tibet, so no entry. India says this is targeted and premeditated. Listen to the government statement, and I'm quoting. Arunachal Pradesh was, is, and will always remain an integral and inalienable part of India. China's action violates both the spirit of the Asian Games and the rules governing their conduct. Now, how has China responded to this? There are two responses. One is from the Chinese government. They say all athletes with valid documents are welcome to China. Listen to this.
As the host, China welcomes athletes from all countries to attend the Games with valid documents. China doesn't recognize the so-called Arunachal Pradesh province you've mentioned. The southern Tibetan region is part of China's territory.
Of course, they mentioned Arunachal Pradesh, but words and maps do not decide authority. The people of Arunachal Pradesh do. Having said that, let's focus on these so-called valid documents. I presume they're talking about visas. Did China not issue visas to these athletes? That's where the second response comes in. This is from the Asian Games officials. They say visas were issued, but India rejected them. Listen to this.
These Indian athletes got already visa for enter in China. China didn't refuse any visa, but the problem is, according to the Chinese government regulations, we have the right to give them different kind of visa. But unfortunately, these athletes didn't accept this visa.
Let me repeat that. We give them different kind of visa. What does that mean? Perhaps staple visas. And it wouldn't be the first time. China did something similar during the World University Games. The same 3 athletes were targeted. China issued them staple visas. Your normal visas are stamped on the passport, but a staple visa is not. It is instead pinned or stapled to the passport, so you can take it off at will. And why does China do this? To assert their claims over Arunachal Pradesh. Reports say China started doing this in 2009. India, however, does not recognize this kind of visa. And this time, New Delhi is escalating matters. A diplomatic protest has been lodged with China. The Sports Minister of India, Anurag Thakur, has cancelled his visit to Hangzhou. That's where the games are being held. China's move should not be seen in isolation, though. They're part of a larger trend. Last month, they released a new map. 2 Indian regions were shown as Chinese territory. One was Aksai Chin, the other was Arunachal Pradesh, the same state. And this obsession is an old one. China considers Arunachal Pradesh to be unfinished business. It's called the 5-finger policy. Mao Zedong came up with it. He said that Tibet is China's right palm. And this palm has 5 fingers: Ladakh, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Arunachal Pradesh. These are the 5 fingers. Mao said China should liberate these regions. In other words, invade and occupy them. Now, do you see why this is a problem? 3 of these so-called fingers belong to India, and 2 others are sovereign nations. But China doesn't care, and recently their approach has become more aggressive. Whether it's border incursions or map warfare or diplomatic escalations, China says, ignore all these problems, let's focus only on the positives. But India has rejected that approach. New Delhi says peace at the border is the #1 priority for India. Fix that and normalization will follow. But clearly China is not interested in that. They're doing the exact opposite, needling India even in sporting events. Just think about it. The Asian Games are supposed to be about unity and solidarity, about showcasing Asia's prowess. You can't do that without India and China. These are 2 countries who will define the Asian century. Yet Beijing chooses to politicize it. We can only hope that global sporting authorities are watching what's going on, that they will take action against China, although considering the recent past, I wouldn't hold my breath. Hosting such events is considered an honor, a privilege for the host country. But China has turned it into a weapon, a stage and opportunity to make petty political points. I mentioned the 5 fingers. The leader of 1 finger is heading to China. Pushp Kamal Dahal, aka Prachand, the Prime Minister of Nepal. He will be attending the Asian Games opening ceremony tomorrow. He will also meet Chinese President Xi Jinping. It's a pretty long visit. Prachand will be in China for 8 days. So what can we expect? China's game plan seems to be pretty clear. pull Nepal away from India. That's what they want. Just look at this article on Chinese state media. Let me quote. While providing some support and assistance, India often resorts to rude and unilateral actions towards Nepal. In contrast, China strictly adheres to the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and never interferes in Nepal's internal affairs. Now, this is supposed to be an opinion piece. It's more of a stand-up comedy. China is notorious for meddling in internal affairs, and they have done so in Nepal as well. Reports say Beijing united the 2 Communist Party factions in Nepal. Prachand himself is a communist, by the way. Apparently, China was betting on ideological brotherhood. Hasn't panned out, though. Just consider the backdrop of this visit. Earlier this month, China's ambassador to Nepal targeted India. He said Nepal was unfortunate to have a neighbor like New Delhi. Listen to what he said.
But fortunately, you had a neighbor like India, because India is a huge market, huge potential you can tap into. But at the same time, India's policy towards Nepal and other neighbors are not so friendly.
Diplomats do not talk like that, but then again, this is a wolf warrior. Days later, Nepal rejected his comment, though. Kathmandu said it is fortunate to have a neighbor like India. In many ways, this episode sums up Prachand's dilemma. He needs money from China, but he cannot abandon his most important partner, that is India. And it's a very tough balance. Prachand has sent some positive signals to New Delhi. For starters, he visited India first. Now, it's been a tradition for Nepalese prime ministers. They always visit India first. Prachand's predecessor considered ending this trend. His name is KP Sharma Oli. There was talk of him visiting China first, but in the end, good sense prevailed. He came to India first. Oli's tenure was bad for India-Nepal ties, though. He released a map claiming Indian territories as part of Nepal. A diplomatic crisis followed, so Prachand's job is tough now. He came to India on a mission to fix the relationship. But in China, he faces the next challenge. Courting Beijing without angering New Delhi, that's his challenge. You may ask, why bother? Why does Nepal need China's help? It has already plunged 2 South Asian countries into crisis, Sri Lanka and Pakistan. So why does Nepal want to be the next one? Because every country likes to have options. Around 65% of Nepal's trade passes through India. Nepal, you see, is a landlocked country. It doesn't have direct access to the sea. So goods are taken from Indian ports to Nepal. And Kathmandu is wary of this arrangement. In the past, India has cut off Nepal's trade routes. There have been months-long blockades. So what are they doing now? They're looking for alternatives. In 2016, Nepal signed a transit agreement with China, basically to use Chinese ports instead of Indian ones. Now, for 7 years, no progress has been made on this. No shipments came, but this month there was headway. The first batch of goods arrived in Nepal via China. Around 15 tons of turmeric came from Vietnam. It's a very symbolic move. But beyond that, what are China's interests in Nepal? Kathmandu did join the Belt and Road Initiative. Again, the progress is nil. Reports say 9 BRI projects were promised, all 9 are stalled. A different project was completed, though, the international airport in Pokhara. China's ambassador claimed that it was built under the BRI. Nepal rejected it. They said the agreement was signed before Nepal joined the Belt and Road. Still, India is not happy. New Delhi has refused to allow flights between Pokhara and Indian airports. And this is the tough balance we talked about. New Delhi wants Nepal to put India first. But Kathmandu wants options, not just in China, but even beyond. For instance, they have approved a US project as well. It's called the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Under this deal, the US will give $500 million to Nepal, and these are grants, not loans. So India has its work cut out in Nepal. Having said that, we have a natural advantage. India and Nepal share a lot of history and culture. Cross-border communism cannot replace that. Even on trade, New Delhi holds the edge. The overland route via China to Nepal is 3,000 kilometers, and via India, just 800 kilometers. So all factors point to Nepal benefiting from India, which is why New Delhi will be watching Prachand's visit closely. When the war broke out in Ukraine last year, the West jumped into action. Nations gave weapons to Ukraine. Europe took in millions of refugees, there was widespread condemnation and a general sense of unity. But 576 days later, the feelings are a little different. On paper, there may be unity, but on ground, the political knives are out for Kiev. Volodymyr Zelensky got a taste of this yesterday. He was in Washington to shore up support, but it wasn't all rosy. The last time Zelensky was in Washington, he got a hero's welcome. This time, it was a mixed reception. On one side, there were his supporters like Joe Biden. He greeted Zelensky at the Oval Office. He announced a new aid package. This one's worth $325 million.
We're committed to help Ukraine build a force capable of ensuring Ukraine's long-term security, capable of deterring future threats against sovereignty, territorial integrity, and freedom, which are underway now. Because that's what this is all about, the future of freedom. America can never, will never walk away from that.
Then Zelensky headed to the capital. There was some bipartisan support there too. There was talk of solidarity, sticking together for the long haul, the usual stuff. But there was also some criticism. It came from a group of Republicans. They're questioning the aid that Washington is giving Kiev. Most of these Republicans are Trump supporters. They supported Ukraine last year, but now they're skeptical. So support for Kiev has drawn a fault line over Washington. And it starts with Donald Trump. Trump claims that he will end the war in a day if he becomes president. And you would think that would be good news for Ukraine, but it is not. It's a pledge that's more likely to help Putin. And Zelensky knows this, which is why his latest trip was like a preview, a glimpse of what could be in store if Trump becomes president in 2024. You see, for Kiev, America is like $1 million lifeline. They cannot risk losing it. But if Biden is not in power, they cannot bank on American support. Republicans are growing weary of this war, and so is the American public. So things could change in the blink of the eye, just like it did for Poland. When the war began, Warsaw was a firm Ukrainian ally. It sent military aid, it sent equipment, it took in refugees, it did everything that a good neighbor and friend would do. But now Poland seems to have abandoned Ukraine.
We are no longer transferring any weapons to Ukraine because we are now arming ourselves with the most modern weapons. If you don't want to defend yourself, you should have what it takes to defend yourself. That's the rule we follow, and that's why we made larger orders of military equipment.
That was the Polish Prime Minister. He says Poland is no longer giving weapons to Ukraine. And Zelensky only has himself to blame for this. He tried to dump Ukrainian grain in Poland, and this led to a drop in prices. The Polish farmers suffered, so Poland refused to take Ukrainian grain. They have an election coming up, and they do not want to upset their farmers and their voters. Poland's governing party chose their farmers over Ukraine. And what did Zelensky do? He sued Poland. He filed a complaint at the World Trade Organization. There was a war of words. It turned into a full-blown crisis. And the losing party here is Ukraine, because right now for Poland, it's less about the grains and more about public sentiment. Same with Slovakia, another ally of Ukraine. The country is going to poll soon, and the front-runner is this man, Robert Fico. He is a pro-Russian populist. He has vowed to cut arms supplies to Ukraine. If he wins, Ukraine could lose another major ally. So from Slovakia to the United States, the picture is basically the same. The shadow of Ukraine fatigue is hanging over election campaigns, and this is a serious worry for Kiev. To win the war, they need support. And that doesn't seem so ironclad right now, because this is a war with no end in sight, and as things stand, Ukraine's fate seems aligned with the political destiny of its allies. If they win, Zelensky has a shot at winning. If they lose, he most certainly loses. And now we'll turn our attention to the Sudan. It has two rival military factions. On one side is the Sudanese army, on the other is the Paramilitary Rapid Support Force, or RSF. Now, they've been fighting in their country. Yesterday, they took the battle to the United Nations. The heads of these two warring factions unleashed their ire, not through weapons, but through words. First, the RSF leader spoke. He was not there in person. He gave a rare video recording from an undisclosed location. Then the Sudanese army leader took the UN podium. So both sides made competing addresses, sort of like an international pick-me battle. It's one of the many awkward moments to have befallen the marble dais at the United Nations General Assembly. It has witnessed speeches that go from funny to downright bizarre. Here's a report.
Since its inception, the UN General Assembly has been a forum for rigorous debate. The 193 members discuss the world's most vexing issues, be it development, poverty, or peace. This year, the UN General Debate opened on the 19th of September against a dark backdrop of the ongoing war in Ukraine, political crises in West Africa and Latin America, economic instability, climate change, and the Wuhan virus that just won't stop lingering around. In this high-level meeting, tempers often run high, leading to lofty declarations and audacious rhetoric, sprinkled with odd hilarity and awkward meltdowns. Speaking of awkward, Sudan comes to mind. Its two warring military factions indulged in a hasty battle yesterday. But instead of weapons, they used words as the UN witnessed an international pick-me battle. Sudan has two rival military factions. On the one hand is the Sudanese army, led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. On the other hand is the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemedti. The two have been at war since April this year. At the UN, the two military heads were seen, well, butting their heads.
We call upon the international community to designate these groups and their allies as terrorist groups that must be countered by all. They must be fought to protect the Sudanese people, the region, and the entire world.
Then came army leader Burhan to counter Hemedti.
The RSF is fully prepared to declare a ceasefire throughout Sudan. Dialogue should lead to a comprehensive political solution and the establishment of a civilian government.
Both sides blamed the other for starting the war. No surprises there. But this wasn't the only anticlimactic moment at the UNGA. All eyes were also on the Security Council's meeting on Ukraine. Everyone seemed to be waiting for when Ukrainian President Zelensky and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov would cross paths. But alas, they didn't. Zelensky left before Lavrov arrived. But there was no dearth of strange moments. As Zelensky denounced Russia as a terrorist state, the Russian ambassador was seen looking at his phone. In turn, when Lavrov claimed that Kyiv is violating the UN Charter, the Ukrainian ambassador returned the favor. He had his eyes on his phone. Fubbing at the UN? Seriously. In case you didn't know, fubbing is when someone snubs anyone in favor of a phone. But such oddities aren't rare at the UN. For years, its marbled dais has witnessed several of them. In 2017, Trump threatened to totally destroy North Korea.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
In 2012, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned that Iran was months away from acquiring a nuclear weapon. He brought a diagram.
A red line should be drawn right here.
Now, nuclear science may be complex, but Netanyahu's diagram was basically a cartoon depicting a round bomb with a fuse. And in 2006, when Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez called the then US President George W. Bush the devil.
Yesterday, the devil was here in this same place. It still smells of sulfur, this podium where I am speaking. Yesterday, ladies and gentlemen, from this same place, the President of the United States, who I call the devil, came here speaking as the owner of the world, In
2019, then UK PM Boris Johnson told the UN members about a non-existent dystopia that would result in terrifying limbless chickens. Now, we could go on, kind of like in 2009, when the late Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi raged against the superpowers for 100 minutes. But don't worry, we know you get the drift, unlike Gaddafi.
Our next story is about diamonds. They could be the latest casualty of geopolitics. There's a trade war brewing. The The target is Russian diamonds, and the impact will be felt by India's diamond polishing industry. It's the biggest in the world, India's industry. India polishes about 90% of the world's diamonds. Your Tiffany's, Chopard and Signet diamonds, they mostly come from the city of Surat in Gujarat. Diamond polishing is the lifeblood of Surat. The Ukraine war is already hurting it.
Because of the Russia-Ukraine war, 30,000 to 50,000 workers in Surat have lost their jobs. We can only pray to God that the war will end. If the war does not end, we don't know how bad things will get in the days ahead.
That was from last year. First, there was undersupply. Now there's a supply glut. So much so that India has asked Russia to pause, to halt the supply of diamonds. But there's no stability in the diamond market. And things may get a lot worse next year. That's because a new plan has been put in motion. The G7, along with Belgium, are working on this plan. They want to curtail Russia's multi-billion-dollar diamond industry. They're planning to close a loophole, one that has left Russia's diamond industry relatively unscathed.
Approximately 40% of the rough diamonds have been imported from Russia, and that is through Alrosa mines. Okay, they are the miners from Russia, and that is a big quantity and the big amount also involved in it.
Russia's Alrosa is the biggest diamond exporting group in the world. 1/3 of the company is state-owned, meaning the government of Russia directly benefits from diamond sales. And how much has it benefited? Last year, Moscow made about $4.5 billion from diamond exports. That may not sound like very much, but during a war, every little bit counts. And no one will say no to $4.5 billion US dollars. So Russian diamond sales have helped fuel the war in Ukraine. They allow Moscow to keep building its war chest. And this is common knowledge. Russia has faced 11 rounds of European sanctions. You know what's been missing? EU sanctions on Russian diamonds, they've not come. The US and the UK have sanctioned the Russian stones, but the EU avoided it so far. Do you know why? Personal interest. You see, most of the world's diamond trade goes through Antwerp in Belgium. And Belgium, of course, did not want this trade to stop. After all, diamonds are a big business. The US is the world's biggest buyer of diamonds, but the EU is not too far behind. So Belgium wanted to keep buying from Russia. Of the $4.5 billion that Russia made last year, $1.5 billion was from the European Union. And this was money from diamond sales. So for all of Europe's lectures, it was funding Russia's war through diamonds too. The EU did consider sanctions, but Belgium vetoed it. And for the EU to impose sanctions, all 27 member countries must agree, hence no action against the Russian stones. But now that has changed. Belgium is finally on board. It has even come up with a way to identify Russian diamonds. The West wants to use two methods to track them: blockchain technology and physical checks. Countries will be able to track the origin of every stone they import, so they can effectively impose sanctions on Russian diamonds.
You've had regulation which basically says that if the origin is Russia, so that sounds good, then it's banned basically. But actually what happens is the origin classification gets changed. So if the rough diamond makes its way, for example, to India, and then India manufactures and polishes the rough to a polished diamond, then the origin is changed to India, and then it's sold.
This is what they call the Indian loophole. When a diamond is polished in India, its country of origin becomes India. And from here, it goes to fancy jewelry showrooms across the world. But finally, the EU is banning Russian diamonds and closing this diamond-shaped loophole. Not because it grew a conscience, but because business has fallen. Russian imports to Belgium have fallen by about 45%. This was in the first 3 months of this year compared to last year. So Belgium came on board because it's not making that much money anymore. But for these sanctions to be effective, the diamonds need to be tracked. And for that, India needs to be on board, which is why next week the G7 is sending officials to India. They'll try and convince New Delhi and Surat to help track Russian diamonds. Without India's help, the entire plan falls flat. The question is, will India agree? Surat is home to about 2 million diamond polishers. Times have not been great since the pandemic. Is it fair to ask them to sacrifice more now, especially since the EU agreed only after it saw it had nothing to lose? For our next story, let's go back to 2014. That's when South Korea passed a child welfare law. It said that teachers accused of child abuse would be immediately suspended. On paper, it sounds like a good law, but teachers say parents abused it. They used it to harass teachers, to report them for simply telling a student off. A 23-year-old primary school teacher became the victim of this abuse. In July this year, she was found dead in her classroom. She had died by suicide. The news shook the country. Protests broke out across South Korea. Tens of thousands of teachers took to the streets. They demanded more rights in the classroom. This went on for about 9 weeks. Finally, the government has listened. South Korea has passed a new law, a law to protect school teachers. Our next report tells you more.
In South Korea, this was a scene unlike any other. And since July this year, it's become an all-consuming issue for the country. The East Asian nation is known for its fiercely competitive schools. The society places a lot of weight on its education system. And by proxy, its students and their parents. No matter the school, no matter the family, expectations remain high. But students and parents weren't the only parties under a lot of stress. The teachers too were under pressure. Not because their work itself was impossible, but because the South Korean law didn't protect them. In 2014, the country passed a child welfare law. It dictated that teachers accused of child abuse would be automatically suspended. Teachers say that parents exploited this law. They presented teachers with excessive demands, like favoritism for their children, and they reported teachers for restraining a violent child or telling a pupil off. They say most schools had a culture of malicious complaints. A 23-year-old primary school teacher faced similar abuse. Regular complaints from parents became a source of constant anxiety. And in July, she killed herself. She was found dead inside her classroom. Many parents and students mourned her death.
This is heartbreaking for every citizen in South Korea. How can this happen in the public education field? They studied hard to go to education schools and became teachers because they loved children. Why do they have to die like this in the classroom? Why do people who lead our country say nothing about this?
The teacher's death had a massive impact on her colleagues across the country. This incident outraged them and sparked protests. Tens of thousands of teachers took to the streets. They were seen chanting and holding posters, all demanding one thing, that they get more rights in the classroom.
Unnecessarily heavy workloads disturb class preparations. Teachers are protesting excessive complaints from students and parents, as well as inadequate legal mechanisms and a passive education office and education ministry.
Teachers nationwide protested for 9 weeks, and today they finally won. South Korea has passed a new law. It's called the Teachers' Rights Restoration Bill. It better protects school teachers from complaining parents. Under this legislation, teachers will not be immediately removed following a report of child abuse. Evidence will be required, and there will be further investigation. But that's not all. Financial support will also be made available to teachers fighting lawsuits, and head teachers will have more responsibility to protect their staff. The Korean Federation of Teachers Unions has welcomed this decision, saying it would both protect the right to teach and protect students' right to learn. Though everyone isn't on the same page, some teachers say the new laws don't go far enough. The teachers want the Child Welfare Act amended. They want to improve its very definition, saying that merely disciplining pupils does not count as child abuse. The debate is still ongoing, but one thing is clear. This law may not be perfect, but for South Korean teachers, it's certainly a step forward.
And now it's time for Vantage Chart's images that tell the story. The Ukrainian ambassador gave Pope Francis a teddy bear, symbolizing the children killed by bombs in Ukraine. In a show of strength, Iran displayed drones and missiles at a military parade. And in Finland, 2 F-35 jets landed on a highway for the first time ever. For the first time in the world, in fact. Finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1965, India and Pakistan agreed to a ceasefire after the Second Indo-Pak War. The war broke out when the Pakistani army attempted to take Kashmir by force. This war was seen as a strategic and political defeat for Pakistan. We're leaving you on that note. Thanks for watching. Have a great weekend.
unicamente simbolo di sofferenza di Ucraina.